On reserve accounts. Welcome, LSO staff. If you could introduce yourselves and walk us through the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman, and good morning, committee. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm Polly Scott with LSO Budget Fiscal.
Catherine Camerati, LSO Budget Fiscal.
At the last committee meeting, the committee made a request for a history and a primer on the reserve accounts that we use for our 4 permanent funds.
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic. Thank you.
The Senate is hard of hearing.
Okay, no problem. How's that? Better? Better. Okay. You bet. So we're in your materials, you have a memorandum that is a response to that request for a history of the 4 reserve accounts that we use in conjunction with our spending policies for our permanent funds. It's item 2-01 in your online materials. And that memorandum centers around 9 questions on the reserve accounts. Now, in addition to this memorandum, Catherine and I developed a new online resource on your spending policies, and the reserve account is a component of that. And so what I'd like to do is walk through all the information in your memorandum while demonstrating the online resource that we have for you. So Catherine's going to be browsing for you. And so that you can turn your attention to the screen and you'll see a lot of information up there. The memorandum and the data visualizations have a lot of information, but I will try to keep this presentation brief. Catherine, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to expand your screen to take up the whole screen or not. Okay. Well, first of all, this information is on the WyoLeg website under State Finances, Data Visualizations, and then Spending Policies. Okay, and the first thing that you go to is a landing page. I do want to point out that the spending policy report that this committee provided last year to the legislature before convening is linked in there as a resource for you. And from that point on, it's an introduction and then acronyms for all the funds that are involved in this information. Okay, so starting in, from this point on, there's 10 slides across the bottom that you can scroll through. And from this point on, starting on slide 2, it's organized by fund. So we're starting on the PWMTF, okay? And this first slide, this is what you could consider a picture of our spending policy model since inception. And while the memo goes over this narratively, this is a picture of it. And if you see that dark blue line that is very up and down, mountainous, I guess, is the investment earnings. And you can see how that just is very volatile. And that was, you know, very likely the inspiration that policymakers and appropriators had for establishing a mechanism to smooth out the amount that's available for annual spending. And when you hover over any element of this chart, it's going to give you the amounts. And so that's helpful. Now the tan bars there in the background, that represents the size of the fund. That's our rolling 5-year average market value. And also when you hover over a bar, it shows you the spending policy percentage. And when you multiply those two together, you get the red line, which is our spending policy amount in dollars. And you can see how that red line trends along with the size of the tan bars. And the prior spending policy reports indicate that it was intentional that they kind of linked the size of the fund with the amount available for spending. And that percentage that they used was intended to be a sustainable amount based on investment projections. So for this fund, and you can see by scrolling over the tan bars, we started out at first with an amount that's higher than 5%, but then since 2004, the spending policy percentage has been 5% from there on out. I should point out that there's more in your memorandum really about all of these items, and that if you read, you're gonna learn more. But this is just adding the visual information to it. So when we go to slide the tab 2 of the PMTF, so along the left-hand side, you've got some tabs. The PMTF is the only fund that we have for spending policies where we're distributing the investment earnings to more than one fund. So it started out, through 2016 that it was all distributed to the general fund. And then the legislature modified that and created a distribution that also involved the LISRA and the SIPA. And so, for example, you can easily look at fiscal year 23, and you can see that the investment earnings there is about, I think it's about 244 million or to that effect. And then the first 2.5%, what goes to the general fund, that's about 210 million. The amount over 2.5% is split equally between the LISRA and the SIPA. So the LISRA got 17.2 million, and then the SIPA is insured or guaranteed by the reserve account to get 1.25%. So the first 17.2 million came from investment earnings over 2.5%, and then the rest was backfilled by the reserve account. And so that's just an example of that. The next tab on the left you can go to is a picture of everything that's gone in or out of the reserve accounts since inception. And you've got cards along the right-hand side that tally up for you those amounts. And so just looking at those cards, starting out, we had $6 billion in investment earnings over this time frame from the PMTF. Most of that went out for spending, but there was $1.022 billion that was in excess of spending, and it went to the reserve accounts. We had $177 million going to support spending from the reserve account in 3 different years. Can everybody see the? I'm kind of referring to the slides up here. Yeah, good. And then corpus tips. We've had corpus tips, and you can highlight whichever element of the chart you're interested in. And there's been 6 corpus tips over the years for a total of $589.2 million. And then finally, direct appropriations. There's been $325.2 million in direct appropriations to the reserve account over this time frame. The PMTF is kind of interesting because it's actually had some appropriations coming out of it as well as into it. There's more about that in your memorandum. Right. Oh, right. And I should go back. Catherine reminded me, I should go back to the historical chart. I forgot to mention the teal line there. That's important. That is the distributed amount of our spending policy. While what the red line is the maximum spending policy amount, if we have our maximum available at 5%, the teal line is was actually distributed. And like, for example, you can see prior to 2017, when, look at fiscal year 2016, investment earnings were low that year, and that's all that was distributed for spending. We didn't come up to the maximum amount. Now, it was in, Catherine, if you would go and get the note back, there's a note on the slide that tells you when the guarantees started. So the spending policies started out, and there wasn't a guarantee from the reserve account. It was in fiscal year 2017 when the first 2.5% to the general fund was guaranteed, and then in 2020 when a guarantee of 1.25% to the SIPA was added. And so that's very important. And you can actually see, for example, if you hover over, I think that's fiscal year 2021. If you could click on 2021 for me and just show that, oh, I'm sorry, 20, go back 1 year. In 2020, the distributed SPA is above investment earnings, but below the maximum. And that's an example of how the guarantee of the reserve account works. The reserve account is guaranteeing that difference between the investment earnings of that year and the distributed SPA. Thank you, Catherine, for reminding me that I had left that. out. So now I think what we can do, if there's any questions along the way, please let me know. So the next slide, if we could go to slide 3, this is a familiar resource to all of you. It's the flow chart. It's for fiscal year 24, which I know we're not in fiscal year 24 anymore, but that is our most official, that's our official most recent year that we have. We put this here for your convenience. It's also in the data book and in the spending policy report. All of this information is going to be updated in October for fiscal year 25 when we have the official results. So now we'll move on to the Common School Permanent Land Fund, which is our next fund. And from here, the charts are the same. The elements are the same. And, this picture of our spending model for the Common School really shows you how this mechanism that the legislature put in place to smooth out the amount that's available for spending has worked really well in the case of this fund. And by that, I guess another way to put it is that in most years, the teal line is right on top of the red line, and you've got the spending that you were anticipating. And the guarantee on this fund started, I'm having actually a little bit of trouble reading that, I guess. There's a note up there that tells you when it was started, and it started out as 2.5% in 2016 and then went to the full 5% in 2018. Okay, so now if we want to click on the reserve account history, the cards along the right tally up for you what all these different components of the reserve account have been over the years. And one thing I will note is that in fiscal year 24, you see a large direct appropriation into the fund. And that happened, each one of our funds had a large appropriation in 24, and it was a result of this committee's bill in 2023, House Bill 89, trying to get those reserve accounts up to the 5X. And so that, now one thing I want to point out about the Common School reserve account, it's interesting because of there are constitutional restrictions about the use of investment earnings in the Common School. And they can only be spent for K-12 education. They cannot actually be deposited into the reserve account. So when there are excess investment earnings in the Common School Permanent Land Fund above the spending policy amount, we have to swap them out. And this is provided for in statute with federal mineral royalties, which is a revenue source to the SFP, which is not restricted. And so as a note for fiscal year 25, there is less federal mineral royalties than we anticipate are going to be needed because of the high investment earnings. Investment earnings, as you know, for fiscal year 25 were very robust. And so there is going to be a shortfall there for that swap. More on that later, I guess. Moving on to the next slide. It's just the flow chart for fiscal year 24 on the Common School. And then we'll move on to the Hathaway, which the Hathaway is unique and kind of interesting. The reason why the Hathaway is unique is because there's no % spending policy amount for the Hathaway. The spending policy for this fund has always been the amount necessary to support scholarships. And so the spending is not related to the size of the fund. And you can see that, whereas the other charts, that red line was trending with the size of the fund. This red line does not trend with the size of the fund. And also the reserve account guarantees the full amount needed for scholarships. And so the teal line is right on top of the red line throughout. And you can see by looking at that chart, there's only 3 years when the investment earnings has been below the scholarships. And so there's only been 3 times when the reserve account has had to support. Now moving on to the next tab, which is your reserve account history. One thing I find interesting about the Hathaway is that there has been 10 corpus tips over the more than any other fund, for a total of 137 million tipping back into the corpus. Also, there's only been one direct appropriation to this, to the reserve account, and it was that 4.6 million for House Bill 89. Okay, and then moving on, next we just have the Hathaway flow chart for your convenience. And then slide 8, this is the Excellence in Higher Education Endowment. This fund from inception started out with the 5% spending policy amount guaranteed. The reserve account began to be depleted, really probably because the reserve account maximum in statute was too low, and it would cause corpus tips. And so the reserve account kind of became depleted, at which point the guarantee on the fund, the legislature modified that in 2017 so that the reserve account is only guaranteeing half of the prior year shortfall. And the university and the colleges make up the other half of the shortfall. And they're well aware of that. Also, you can see by hovering over like 2019, 20, and 21 on the tan bars, the spending policy amount on this fund did drop down to 4.75% for 3 years, and then it was moved back up. The legislature moved it back up to 5% in 2022. And I think that coincided with when there were issues for a few years with the reserve account being depleted. Moving on to the second tab on the reserve account history, you can see there were those corpus tips there in the early years, the teal bars, and that's right at the time when the reserve account was having its troubles. And actually that served as a kind of a warning, if you will, and the legislature actually moved those reserve account maximums up for all the reserve accounts at that point in time. And there's more about that in your memorandum. So next we have yes, and there's one really interesting thing on this chart as well. You see that large negative appropriation out of the fund in 2021 of 10.5 million. Yes, okay, let's jump back to the historical for a minute. And you'll see there's a year of very high investment earnings in 2020. I think it's up at 16 million. And for this fund, that was really high investment earnings. Okay, so there would have been a corpus tip in 2020. However, jump back to the other slide, there was a legislative hold on corpus tips in the budget bill that prevented that tip. And so what the legislature did was in the next year, they made just a straight direct appropriation from the reserve account to the corpus for the amount that would have tipped. So on your cards over there on the right, that 10 million is showing as an appropriation instead of as a corpus tip. You could look at it either way, but it technically was a direct appropriation. If you wanted to look at it the other way, it would be 21.3 million of a corpus tip and 13 million in direct appropriations, if you wanted to move that category. Okay, so now we've got the flow chart for the Excellence in Higher Ed. And then moving on, this is our final chart. And it is the reserve account balances compared to the 5X or the 7X. And this is at the end of fiscal year 24. Again, all of this is soon to be updated in October when spending policy results for fiscal year 25 are finalized. But so you could, by clicking on the drop down, you can select the funds with the % spending policy amounts. And right now, all of them are selected because that's the default. So at the end of fiscal year 24, if you wanted to raise all of these funds up to the 7X, it would have taken $769.9 million. Okay, and you can click on an individual fund if you're interested in just one fund, and it'll do the math for you there on the cards. Now the Hathaway is different because it doesn't have the % spending policy amount, so it's got its own card over there. And at the end of fiscal year 25, it was 12.6 million below its statutory maximum. And that's how that works. And I know that there's always a lot of interest in how our reserve account balances are doing compared to the 5X and the 7X. So I wanted to give you just a preliminary update on fiscal year 25. Like you know, our investments did really, really well in fiscal year 25, the most investment earnings we've ever had on record. So the PMTF reserve account, LSO is estimating that that's going to reach the 5X in 2025, but not the 7X. The common school reserve account, like we talked about, it depends on how much we have in FMRs to swap with the investment earnings. We had high investment earnings and low FMRs, so it might take 2 years to swap it out. So LSO is estimating that the common school reserve account is going to be just below the 5X at the end of fiscal year 25. And then the Hathaway reserve account, LSO is estimating that we will have a corpus tip there and it'll be at the maximum. And for the excellence in higher ed, we're estimating that it's going to be at the 5X, but not the 7X. So that wraps up the data visualizations. They're online for you to use and to look at and to think about, and you can hover over specific years. And like I said, that's going to be updated in fiscal year 25. There is one question in your memorandum that doesn't really tie into the data visualizations. And it's question 9. The question is, how much would the 5-year average rolling market value have to increase to offset a reduction in the spending policy amount? And Madam Chairman, if you would like, I could walk through that or not.
Please do.
Okay, thank you. If you would look at your memorandum on the history and the primer on the reserve accounts, starting on page 8, question 9. Last time the committee had a question, how much would the rolling 5-year average market value have to increase to offset either a 0.25% or a 0.5% reduction in the spending policy amount? And so because of our 3 permanent funds that have the percent spending policy amount, they all have the same percent of 5%. The answer is the same for all 3 accounts. And if we reduce it down from 5% to 4.75%, it would take an increase in the 5-year rolling average market value of 5.26% to offset that reduction. If you wanted to think about a 0.5%, you double it, and it's an increase of 11.11% in that 5-year rolling average market value. Now, the paper goes on to give you an example using the PMTF. And basically, if you want to look at the table 7 there, you can see the example is for fiscal year 24. We look at our 5-year average rolling market value. It's 8.9 billion. The 5% generates 444 million for spending. If we wanted to drop that down to 4.75%, we would have to increase that to 9.4 billion. The difference there is 467 million. But because we're dealing with a 5-year average, we have to multiply by 5. That would take a one-time infusion of 2.3 billion to immediately offset that reduction and still have 444 million available for spending. Okay, so that's just a PMTF example. Now, I think the committee also wanted to know, okay, if we waited, and how much time would it take for us to catch up to that prior spending amount? And LSO is estimating that for the 0.25%, it would take about 2 years to catch up. And that's using a growth rate on that 5-year rolling average market of 3.76%. That's based on the past growth rate. So it would take about 2 years to catch up. However, I really want to caveat that by saying you never really catch up, because that 5-year rolling average market continues to grow. So you could consider it that you're always setting yourself back 2 years for spending. I hope that answers your question about how long it takes to offset a reduction in the spending policy amount.
Polly, thank you. Senator Guru.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, a comment. Thank you for that. And for everyone here and everybody listening, going on the Wild Edge homepage and going to that drop down under state finances and data visualization opens up a wealth of information that you can chart and find not only about spending policy, but each individual budget, how many employees are in each budget, what each budget's done over previous years. So for us appropriators, it's also very handy. I'd like to thank the staff for all the work they've done on that. And a big shout out to my good friend, Representative Nicholas, who serves on this board, who spearheaded that update of the big data book that we used to always just get handed to us and kind of set us down this path to help with all these visualizations. So thank you, Bob, for helping with that. I want to make sure I understood it right. We are based on our investment income. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, and all the other things that we just walked through. We're at 5X on all accounts now except for one. And what was that we're just a titch underneath?
The Common School Permanent Land Fund.
Thank
And
you
that's estimated for the end of fiscal year 25. Not
all
quite.
all the others were at 5X and some even closer to 7X than right. Trending positively, as we say.
Correct.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Representative Haroldson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for the visual. I've enjoyed kind of thumbing through it over the last week. But to bring all into that 7X, we're looking at almost that 800 million world, correct? Did I catch that correctly? And am I understanding that correctly?
That was based on fiscal year 24. That number is going to change. And I might be able to give you that number. You know what I'll do? I'll work on that in the break while someone else is presenting.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
But that information is all soon to come. I'd also, if I may, Madam Chairman, like to just remind the committee that staff will be working with Madam Chairman and the committee on the fiscal year 25 spending policy report that this body is statutorily required to submit to the legislature before convening. And all of that information is finalized and comes together in that report. And that's soon to be available in October, November.
Thank you. Any additional questions for Polly from the committee? All right, seeing none, continue with whatever you have.
That was everything. I really did want to thank Catherine publicly with the committee because we worked hand in hand to get those online data visuals for you. And also we are going to be updating them in October, and then all of that fiscal year 25 information will be there for you and you can use it at your convenience.
Kind of a random question, but who is our IT or who's the tech expertise that made the interactive website functions work so well?
I would say we did it together. We kind of divided and conquered. I really managed the data, and Catherine and made the graphs, and Catherine put it online.
It's really, really difficult to do. Thank you so much.
It was really fun, actually, Madam Chairwoman.
It's good to know you like it.
One-
You might be careful about how much more you get. Representative Haroldson?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And if you guys would just indulge me for a few moments for history purposes, can we talk just a little bit about 16? Because in my mind, you hear the 08, the 12, all those drops, but I mean, 16 hurt Wyoming on a massive level. And can we just talk a little bit about what happened there? And I don't want to go into the weeds, but just can you give me just a real quick blip of how we basically came out of 16 with, in our reserve accounts at least, almost no income out of our investments. And I just was wondering what happened. And I could have probably done that through a Google search, but I wanted to just have that discussion real quick.
Yeah, so let
Yeah.
me just go to my spreadsheet here and look at 16. If I
Ms. Scott, I'll let you look through that. Representative Nicholas? I joined the legislature in 17, so I was here to start the drastic cuts. And so Representative Nicholas, if you recall, do you want to give us some insight into your leadership during that
Yes,
time?
please.
I'll correct her if she's wrong.
All right.
Okay.
All right, Scott.
Well, in 2016, I was not yet here as well, but I think it was mainly just a very difficult year for investments. My spreadsheet tells me that our investment income that year was less than half of our spending policy amount. And we did not we did not make the 2.5% for the general fund. I'm talking about the PMTF specifically. And yeah, so there had to be, oh, and that was prior to when we had the guarantee. And so we just had to take the reductions in spending. And I'm sure that that was a very difficult year for appropriators. And I think that same thing was probably mirrored in every account. Now, as to why that was such a difficult year for the investment earnings, I would have to ask someone from the state treasurer's office to maybe talk about that. I just don't have that market history in my mind, in my brain, but maybe someone from the state treasurer's office could.
According to the Oracle, which I refer to as the internet,
Uh-huh.
also as the Oracle, it was a decline in
Yeah.
fossil fuel industry, decline in the oil and natural gas markets as well as coal. As a result of, I think, of just a
Yeah.
lower demand globally and then changing global policy. All right, with that, to keep us on track and on time, we will go to Representative Bear, who has some ideas for the committee to consider from last session.
Thank you,
Representative
Madam
Bear.
Chairman. Appreciate the committee indulging me with a moment to discuss a couple of bills that I sponsored last year that I'd like to present to the committee and see if the committee has interest in taking up for the upcoming session. And this just dovetails right into the discussion we just had. Really appreciate the chairman having that part of the historical and training that we just received on the reserve accounts. And I'm going to just start with specifically the last report that we put out, which we're getting ready to put out on the status of these reserve accounts. And I'm going to point out really what was the purpose, and we have that in our report from last year. The first one is consistent, sustainable flow of earnings for expenditure over time. So the last discussion we just had was 2017, when we didn't have the reserve accounts available to keep the spending flow equal so that we're not having to decrease or increase budgets. Our budgets can be consistent. So that's one reason the reserve accounts were established. Another is to protect the corpus of the permanent funds from inflation. And that's the tip portion that we have in statute, where we're tipping into those accounts and we're not taking off of the earnings so much so that we don't cover our inflation. And lastly is to the extent practicable, increases in earnings available for expenditure to offset the effects of inflation. And to this is really the purpose that I brought these two bills. They'll serve the other two purposes as well, but is to offset what we're going to see potentially in less revenue from other sources. We've already seen a historical drop in revenues from mineral, where we had in the past upwards of 70% of our state revenues coming from the mineral industry. The example that was just discussed of 2016, minerals had a huge effect. We didn't have it also affected our earnings, and so therefore we didn't have that funding available. We didn't have the reserve accounts really established in a way that protected us, so we ended up with being forced to make drastic cuts in the budget. So that's the reason the reserve accounts exist. These two bills only address two of the 4 reserve accounts we've been discussing so far, and that these two are on the big accounts, the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund and the School Land Fund. And so these would affect those funds available to the General Fund, the LISRA, and the SIPA out of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, and it would affect the School Foundation Program funding out of the Permanent Land Fund. And what these bills do is very simple, is reduce the spending amount. If you recall those charts that we looked at earlier, Polly did a great job of providing those. You had the solid line that was following the bar charts. And then you saw the actual, which was the up and down, looked like a heartbeat on a EKG. So what we're proposing with these two bills is to reduce the amount of that solid line so that we, on those heartbeat the up and downs would be reduced, the distance away from the solid line. So what we're doing is smoothing the curve, if you will, by reducing the spending policy. So the bills propose moving from 5% spending policy down to 4.5% spending policy. On the school side, it's a little bit more graduated, much like what was done earlier by this committee and the Appropriations Committee on all of these spending policies. That one is graduated over a 2-year period. And remember, Polly just shared with us, it would take a 2-year period to overcome the losses if we reduced our spending policy. So by slowing it down a little bit, it just makes it work a little smoother. And so that is a 4.75 in the first year and 4.5 in the second year. That is what was House Bill 271 last year or last session. I would also add that on the school foundation side, because we have a backstop out of the LISRA, there is really no reduction in monies available to the block grant. The block grant is always going to be guaranteed, but my hope is that if we reduce the amount of spending right out of our investment funds, then over time, we're going to have higher rate of return. Again, if you look at House Bill 89 from 2023, the whole idea of setting the 5X and 7X numbers is that our Treasury Department, our investment team, which we work closely with on this committee, would have the ability to make longer term investments with higher rate of return. So as Polly was discussing the 2 years for the raw dollars, but she also pointed out that if you take into account that the 5-year rolling average is increasing, if you take that into account, the raw dollars should be increasing as well. But also, if we're investing in longer term investments and getting a higher rate of return, we should be able to apply compounding of those investments. That will do 2 things for us. That will put more money tipping back into the corpus, which was stated in the last meeting that we had, that it was a very conservative move led by the Senate to put $2.4 billion into those permanent funds. Well, if that's the case, this action will increase those tips into the corpus, which in turn will give more money to the investment team to invest in those accounts. And then those returns would increase as well. So by restricting from 5% flow out of the permanent funds, their earnings, to 4.5, we actually increase that number at a higher rate. So with that, I don't want to get it too complicated, but that's the 30,000-foot view. Pretty simple bills. We're just saying, hey, we're going to reduce the spending so that we can smooth out what's available over time to the body and to the state of Wyoming for spending. But we're also going to allow our investment team to have more funds to invest in longer term investments to get a higher rate of return. So with that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation there, Representative Bear. Just out of curiosity on the rate of reduction, do you know how much appropriations that would roughly be for that first quarter, and then the second year was 0.5%?
Yes, and I'm going to go back to what I presented, and you had to sit through a lot of presentations on the floor in the last session in this regard, but it was 24 million for the biennium for the common, for the permanent mineral trust fund that would be reduced, and then it was about 12 to 17 million on the common school fund. So that reduction again, that 24 million, we would be putting directly into these reserve accounts. And so that's the amount that would get invested over time. And that's the target we were looking for how long does it take to get that 24 million back? Well, we heard today 2 years, without doing anything. It could be as long as 6 years to get that back if we didn't have compounding. But I think the compounding just about guarantees us the 2-year period for that amount. And back to the Common School Fund, or the School Foundation Program, that 17 million, that really doesn't go away because we're going to backstop that out of our LISRA. But what we'd like to do is make sure that that doesn't last long, because we don't want to keep having to backstop that. And again, that rate of return is a 2 to 6 years that we would get that. And I would like to point out, since you asked that question, Madam Chair, if I may, is that every year we delay reducing that is a year we delay getting that solidly, 5X there where the investment team can do that. And we've done a good job of putting money into the corpus of the big funds, but unfortunately, we've been languishing on these reserve accounts, and pretty excited about what happened in 2023 as far as the 5X idea and 7X. That's, if you look at what happened with the education endowment fund, higher education endowment fund, we got into trouble because we only had 1.5 times in that account, and we had a spending policy that allowed that to be wiped out, if you will. And so this measure really ensures just one more way of ensuring that those accounts are solid, we're getting the investments, and we get the returns. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Representative Bear, we have a question from Senator Guru, and then we'll go to Representative Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Representative Bear, thank you. You testified tonight, about what's happened in the last couple of years. Last legislature put more money into the PTMF than any legislature as far as a direct appropriation since statehood. We've also worked on our reserve accounts and worked towards the 5X, 7X, which we just heard in previous testimony. So what I'm gathering, your bill, what this bill does is just lock in something that frankly we've been doing as needed as we've gone along in the last few years. So here's my question. Given the volatility of our revenues right now, where we've kind of had to go away from coal and that mineral severance, which may be coming back, we don't know, could be, but right now it's not. And so now we're looking at some volatile sources of income. Why would this plan be better than what we've been doing the last couple of years, which in a very conservative way has been doing the exact same thing?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So great question. And I would say that this is just adding to what we've been doing. And you're correct. This is kind of locking things down for the future. And so that ensures that we know, what we're going to be doing. We know that we've got consistent reserve accounts, that they're protected by this spending policy. And just like we did in House Bill 89 when we set the 5X and 7X, the whole reason was to give our investment team a level of confidence. This too would add to that level of confidence. One of the things that you mentioned is that infusion of $2.4 billion and then the next year $700 million, so a little over $300 million that we've put into endowment funds and reserve accounts, savings, if you will. I think that, we can't count on that. And so having a spending policy that protects us over the long run, whether those infusions can happen or not, is a good idea. So thank you for the question.
Representative Nicholas.
Madam Chair, thank you. So I just want to double check the numbers first. My numbers that I grabbed yesterday was that the biennial effect on the permanent mineral trust fund was about 52 million. I'm looking over at staff. Is that the correct number?
One moment and I will answer that.
Madam Chairman, I'll confirm that
Yeah, and
number.
that's
I think
the
I said
biennial.
biennium, but it was really annual because we were in the,
Yeah.
I was thinking that, we were in the supplemental budget, so that was a one-year
Right.
number.
So
Do you have a
the school
follow-up?
budget, it's roughly 27 million is mine. And that's the direct impact of that we'll have on that in the 0.5%.
Yeah, because the spending policy I'm sorry, Madam Chairman, because of the spending policy or the volume in the permanent land fund being smaller, the dollar amount for that spending policy is going to be smaller as well. So 50 million on a biennium, 25 million on an annual basis on the permanent mineral trust fund, the general fund side. And then I think it was 17, so about 34 million in a biennium for the school side.
Follow up, Representative Nicholas.
Yeah, my number on the school side is about 27. Yes. So, but here's my question. By doing this and the monies that we take away from both the general budget fund side and the school side, if you look at the long-term forecast, for example, on the school side, we have a negative 184 million coming right in front of us.
Mhm.
How does this impact that? Both in the short run and the long run, because and then in addition, as part of that question, because we have established these reserve accounts to be basically an inviolate nature. I mean, statutorily at any rate.
Mhm.
Meaning once those dollars are in the reserve account, they can't come out other than through capital gains or dividend increases. And so given the clear shortfall that we have coming in front of us, so by having a lower spending policy, we're basically fueling, it appears to me, we're fueling that negative cash flow that we're going to be hitting in the next couple of years.
Madam Chairman, Representative Nicholas, great question. And this is how I would put it. Short-term pain for long-term gain. And the reason I say that is because when we're taking those monies away, you know, what I'm saying 17 million a year, you're saying 25 million a year to 27 million a year, whichever number it is, they're not going away from the school spending apparatus, if you will. They're being put into long-term investments to generate greater returns. That's the whole 5X idea. So we would have a couple of years based on what we're seeing for ROI or return on investment, at least for the raw dollar amount, for 2 years. But that 2-year period, and as you say, it would be added to that deficit that we're talking about in our long-term forecast on spending for the school program, which would be made up out of our savings account, the LISRA, our rainy day fund. But what we're doing is we're creating more cash flow in the future. So we've seen that on a about a 6-year time frame, we would make that up just in investment returns. But that's not even counting compounding, because remember, if we get to that 7X, we're actually tipping into the corpus where we're also doing long-term investing. And so the 4.5%, the reduction is going in raw numbers is going to be met up, I believe, faster than the 6-year period. And we want to do something before we get to that even long. I mean, we're on a trajectory based on spending and revenues of being negative, and worse on the school foundation side. So making long-term investments, which we've proven over time now by the fact that now 30% or better of our state revenues are coming from investments, allowing those investments to be the kind of investments that make up for those losses on FMRs on the school side or on mineral income on the general side. I just think it's a wise idea, and it's better to start now rather than later, because that long-term forecast, if you just keep taking it out, it gets worse and worse the longer we wait.
Follow up.
Okay, one more follow-up, and then we're going to go to Senator Crum, who's been waiting. So it's a good dialogue between the two of you, but I'm not sure the rest of the committee is as engaged.
Oh,
I think she
Yeah,
has an answer.
Polly?
May I just respond? At this point in time, 0.5% on the PMTF is 50 million, and 0.5% on the common school is 25 million. But remember, on the House Bill 270, at times we only get that 0.5% reduction if we reach the 5%. Otherwise, it's a 0.25% reduction on our guaranteed spending policy amount. So 0.25% in the PMTF is 25 million.
Madam Chair, is the 50 million an annual number or a biannual number?
That is an annual number.
So it's 100 million, not a biannual number.
Yeah, right.
0.5%, yes.
50 million. So my follow-up question.
It's your last one.
So the deficits that we're talking about, the 184 million on the school side, that is the result primarily of $130+ million cut in property taxes. So that's an self-inflicted funding loss by the actions of our legislature last year. Given the fact that we have basically girdled the income to the schools by roughly 130 a biennium based upon the property tax relief. When you compound that with reducing the amount of cash flow available from the 5% down to 4.5%, which is not, she just told us that's another 50 million. As I understand it now, when the new long-term revenue is going to come out, it's going to take that 184 million and probably increase it to about 225 million. And if you add in the big beautiful bill where it drops the severance tax or the FMRs that come in, that's going to be an impact of $70 million a biennium on the general fund side, plus $30 million on the school side. So what we're doing is we got three different prongs all coming after these dollar flows. And the way that we're operating this, it's just going to be a bigger and bigger cut unless we can balance the dollars that come in and come out to accommodate all of these things that are happening at the same time. And I just want to back that up because obviously, you know that I'm a big fan of getting to 5% and giving to 7%. And my real question is this the best way to do it? Or can we be more strategic about it? And so we've got everything in front of us and we're not cutting off the left hand to serve the right end.
So Representative Bear, I'm going to interpret that as a rhetorical question of, is this the best plan? Assuming that because you're presenting it, you believe that to be true. Representative Nicholas does not, and thank you for that rationale. I'm going to pivot to Senator Crum so the rest of the committee stays engaged. Senator Crum.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, my question is just more of clarification too, is the goal, as I understand it, to get to 7X? We're going to reduce, we got a 5% spending limit right now. We want to reduce that to 4.5%, with the goal being to get to 7X. That's the goal.
Madam Chairman, Senator Crum, absolutely, that is the goal. And again, when we get to that 7X, we're solidly set in so that the investment team can feel confident in making longer term investments, but also there's now a tip. So any excess funds are going to tip right into that permanent fund. So getting to the 7X is just a really important thing, and this will expedite that. I would like to make one comment based on the last question. There is a policy question here. Do we want to take the short-term pain to get the long-term gain? And not only do we see the deficits increasing because we've reduced property taxes on homeowners, but also because we have an ever increasing spending out of our, in our education system. We're now looking at, based on transportation and special education, we're really looking at a 6% year-over-year increase in school funding. And so how are we going to keep up with that? Inflation's about 2.5%. How do we keep up with something that's 6% increases? And this is a model that will help with that. If we do have to make a policy decision, do we want to take the short-term pain for the long-term gain?
Follow up from Senator Crum, and then we'll go to Senator Driscoll.
So yes, Madam Chairman, thank you. Question would be, so we reached the 7X, we hear 2 to 6 years, whatever, none of us really know. But is there anything in this bill then when we get to 7X that would take it back to 5%? Once we've met the goal, does it have a reversion back to the 5%? Because 5% has kind of been a determined where everybody can count on what we're going to spend. Now we're going to take it to 4.5 if this bill goes through.
Representative.
Madam Chairman, thank you for the question, Senator Crum. Really, no, it does not. The short answer is no. The reason, is there a reason why? Well, it does complicate it. You're talking about percentages and multipliers, but you could do that. I would recommend not doing that. And the reason I would recommend not doing that is because the volume of dollars is ever increasing. So even though you're at 4.5% of your earnings off of these permanent funds, the dollars are continuing to grow. So your budgets are going to be allowed to increase based on those dollars. And you're really giving the investment team consistent something that they can count on so that they can make those types of investments that get higher rate of return.
Madam Chairman, probably a little commentary and a little wandering around. Representative Nicholas, thank you for a couple of us have been here for a long time through the $400 million budget cuts. To lock ourselves into this, and this came earlier, is pretty frightening to me. I look back to what Senator Drew said, and we can voluntarily do what's in these bills by doing it, which we chose an approach last year not to do. We actually had some bills that we could do some of this very same thing, and we chose not to do that from the very people that are bringing it. Mine is, can you walk us through the next 6 years of the LISRA on a long-term forecast? Because I think it's pretty clear when you start adding all these up. The LISRA's got innumerable impacts coming on it. And a lot of them you can write down right now. That doesn't count any of our stuff that comes out of left field during session. And the worst thing anybody can do in financial planning is to lock you into that long-term future you're talking about and put you on a path to where you can't pay your bills. And I think that's potentially where we're putting ourselves at, is if we pass these, we've now taken away the flexibility without really doing serious actions of not putting ourselves into a budget crunch. And we talked earlier about the self-inflicted. The last question I'm going to ask you is, you guys that come out, are you going to go back into the LISRA for backfill on the property tax? We keep hearing that, and I realize that isn't totally related to this, but it has a big impact. Are we going to backfill 150 million out of the LISRA? Because we're putting the LISRA on a path to be bankrupt. And it's really interesting, because my question is this just a plan to actually get us to where we're in a crisis on the budget? Because the truth is, we have money right now if we plan correctly, but we can put ourselves into a self-inflicted. So I'd really like you to walk me through the LISRA, where you see it's at and where it's going to end up at.
Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for the question, Senator. I would say that, again, it goes back to short-term pain for long-term gain. I mentioned to Representative Nicholas earlier that our hope is to stop having to use the backfill in a very rapid way by getting those higher rate of return. You mentioned that we're reducing the revenue that's available, and we're really locking ourselves in. And I would push back and say that we've locked ourselves in at 5%. And so really what this comes down to, in terms that everybody can understand at their kitchen table when they're doing their budget, this is saying, okay, we know we're making $100, and we have $5 left over at the end of the month. We're going to lock ourselves into spending $90, so we've got $10 at the end of the month. That's the lock-in that this does. This actually locks us in at a lower amount of spending, but allows us to create a bigger amount of revenue. Of the revenue sources that the state of Wyoming has, we have taxation, and that's in a large part dependent on minerals. We have our investment income. And then we have other things that I would consider taxation, fees, those types of things. The one that we have the most control over is our investment returns. And so if we're going to lock ourselves into something, 5% or 4.5%, I would suggest that we do what we can to increase the one type of revenue that we have the most control over. We can raise taxes to give the government more money, but that always has an effect on the economy. So we don't really control that one. The economy controls how much the state gets from taxation. But we control whether we're going to have long-term investments with high rate of return, or we're going to have short-term investments with a lower rate of return.
Are there any final comments from Representative Bear before we move on to consider any potential motions? Representative Storr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do think it's worth taking a look at what the Revenue Committee was looking at a couple weeks ago, which is that the residential exemptions went from about $20 million in taxes that were not collected to about 10x of that, almost 200 million from 24 to 25. And so it does seem to me that much of that is also coming from the 4% cap, and much of that is coming from wealthy second homeowners in Teton County. So I really think it is also the question of, are we giving tax breaks to people who don't need them in order to cut school funding or reduce the LISRA, in order to do what you're suggesting.
Madam Chairman, thank you for the question, Representative Storr. They are apples and oranges, really. You're talking about taxation, and as in my last comment, I mentioned that we can control some of that in regards to exemptions, as you point out. But really, you know, we want to increase revenues in the area where we have the most control, and that's what these two bills do. This has to do with our investment returns. What you're discussing is what are we going to do about the taxation returns? I understand your point. I think it could be argued that if you reduce taxation, that you end up actually getting more revenues in the long run. Those homeowners that you're talking about having more money, hopefully will spend that money in our economy, creating more and more revenue in those other taxation sources. For instance, one of those wealthy homeowners in their second home, you know, they're going to invest maybe in a jet, and that jet's going to burn a lot of jet fuel, and that's going to impact our mineral industry in a positive way. So the more jet fuel we make and sell, the more revenue we get from the gas industry, and the oil industry. So that is a long-term turnaround to help the school foundation. This is, although I've mentioned that there will be a short-term pain for a long-term gain, it's much shorter term for that gain than what I just described.
All right, committee, we'll have Representative Bear come back to the dais, and just to kind of help move us along, we are 36 minutes beyond our agenda time frame. So we will go ahead and entertain any action from the committee at this time.
Madam Chairwoman, I would move that we consider House Bill 270's draft.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Representative Haraldson, seconded by Representative Wasserberger. Discussion. Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at page 4 of 10, just as an example, Common School Permanent Land Fund. The rate of growth in the spending policy amount. Can somebody tell me what that average has been over the last 10, 15 years? How much is that amount growing percentage-wise? And I would like to contrast that with the rate of inflation over the same period.
Ms. Scott,
Madam Chair, if you could give me just a moment, I will give you that information.
any further discussion as Ms. Scott gets that information? All right, seeing none, we'll wait a minute. Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would just say that question was really about House Bill 271. The motion on the table right now is 270, which is the general fund side. It'll be good to have that information. I think we're going to find that it's somewhere between that 4.5% and 5%. And so having the gap, whether it's on the 270, House Bill 270 and the general fund side or the 271, just protects those reserve accounts even further.
Representative Pendergraft, was that your question? Do you have?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really, the question goes to both the Permanent Mineral Land Fund and all of these funds. My question is, by how much is our spending policy amount growing in excess of inflation? If we have a bigger piece of pie, you got a bigger percentage or a smaller percentage. It just seems to me like right now our spending is outpacing inflation, which means we have a built-in growth. And I would like to try to flatline that in my own mind.
Chair, there's a graph out there that has that data in it that I put together about 2 or 3 weeks ago. If someone asked Don Richards, they can probably circulate it. But in fact, the numbers are just the opposite. If you took the inflation over time, we are spending less. But that graph is out there if we can find it, Holly. But
We'll just-
basically, I had that put together as part of to mirror what the highway department, even though they're expending more, their dollars are basically less than they've been, and that's going down that way. So that was the genesis of why I did it on the general fund and school side.
Although a bit unorthodox, I think right now we'll take a short mid-morning break recess to give Ms. Scott an opportunity to find those questions, those answers to Representative Pendergraft's questions as they relate to both potential bills and both motions to really expedite our understanding of their impact. And so with that committee, we'll take a short mid-morning break and we'll come back in 10 minutes at 9:50 a.m. Thank you. Time is 9:50. We're calling the meeting back to order. The time is 9:50. We are calling the meeting back to order. We are now live. Senator Driscoll, Representative Bear, the meeting is back in order. So,
Yes.
Ms. Scott?
Yes. Madam Chair, to answer Representative Pendergraft's question about how much the spending policies have increased over the last 10 years, for the PWMTF, the increase between fiscal year 2015 and 2024 is a 56% increase. For the common school, it's an 81% increase. If you want to know inflation during that same time frame, it's 35%.
Could you say that one more time?
Yes, the increase in the spending policy amount in the PWMTF, as calculated by the 5% of the 5-year rolling average market value, between 2015 and 2024 has increased by 56%. For the common school, that increase has been 81%.
56%, did you say?
Yeah,
81%? Is that?
for the common school. Yes, for the common school. 35%. That's the CPI-U between that timeframe.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
You're right. Sorry.
all right.
Madam Chair.
Representative Pendergraft.
I'm sorry, I could hear everything except the percentages themselves. Your voice kind of dropped off and I could not hear the numbers. I beg one more time.
Common school, permanent mineral trust fund, 56%, common school, 81%.
Okay, that is, please clarify for me, that is the rate of increase?
The increase in the spending policy amount between fiscal year 2015 and fiscal year 2024. In the dollars, increase in the dollars.
All right, I'm going to call.
Thank you.
Treasurer Meyer, thank you. I'm going to call a point of order here. We took a break and we got a little loosey-goosey in our decorum. I think what's hard for us to hear is, it's hard to hear in this room because of acoustics, but then when we all try to talk and be helpful, we then drown out the primary speaker to give the information. So does everyone have a clear understanding of what the percentages are and what they mean? So Ms. Scott, I just have a follow-up question. And so the answer is from 2014 to 2020 or 2015 to 2024, the spending policy has increased by 56%. Is that correct?
For the PMTF, yes,
For
correct.
the PMTF. But what does that really mean? Does that mean that the Wyoming legislature is spending 56% more dollars from 2015 to 2024? So can you help us really understand what that means? Because I think it's easy to infer that when we talk about a spending policy.
And so, Madam Chair, if I can respond to that.
Can I have Ms. Scott respond to it first and then we'll follow up with you? Thank you.
Madam Chair, I would say that that means that the 5-year rolling average market value is increasing. And that's why the dollars is increasing.
And to follow up on that for further clarification, what does that market value mean on that 5-year rolling average? What are we talking about?
Madam Chairman, the market value is the value of the total invested value of the fund. That includes the unrealized capital gains.
And for further clarity, when we say spending policy, does that mean the money is actually spent? Ms. Scott?
Madam Chairman, no, the spending policy amount would be the maximum spending policy amount, not the distributed spending policy amount.
Representative Nicholas?
Thank you. And so there's a graph that they circulated, you all have sitting in front of you. Because the issue has become the difference between the SPA and that growth, which is what we, the legislature, have been trying to grow every year. And if you add in the 2023, where we put 1.6 billion in, that takes, I mean, that skews everything, because what we're talking about is the 5-year rolling average. And we just changed that. We turned that on its head literally in the last couple of years. But if you look at what we're spending in terms of state government, which I think was the crux of what we're trying to get at, our buying power has actually decreased since 2012. Which means is we're spending less dollars and we're operating the government on less dollars than we did back in 2012 and 14. If you take the inflationary value of money over time. And so so they're two totally different things. But just addressing what we are as a government and our responsibility of not overspending and spending within our means is this graph addresses that. The spending policy will continue to grow because for a perfect example is take our earnings at roughly 7% this year. That's a total of, I believe, $2.1 billion additional revenues. Because we have averaging 7% on $32 billion. And that's going to continue to go up, or on average, particularly on the 5-year rolling average, because we're going to continue to grow our corpus. And that's exactly what we've created the world that we live in, which is most other states just don't have that ability.
So just as a additional point of order here, and to the members of the public, and the video being recorded, we're not being live streamed due to some technical issues with our platform. But this handout that's been provided to the committee as to rely on as part of its deliberative process in voting will be added to our agenda items so the public can also see this graph that's been prepared, of which we're reviewing, just so you know. And so as indicated, this graph was prepared by LSO budget fiscal staff. And looking at this, it appears that our buying power is in yellow, our revenue trend is in green, and our buying power trend is headed downward in red. Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And this graph, I think, illustrates reality. The government does have to deal with inflation and reduce buying power. But I would point out that so do the people of Wyoming. And what the difference I see is that the people of Wyoming, wages have been flat over the same period. And so the people of Wyoming really don't have a way of increasing their revenues to maintain their lifestyle. And the discussion here is turned into, rather than how can we maximize our revenues out of our savings and our investments, to what is the spending of the state and how does that relate to inflation? Well, if we look at the people who we support and who we represent, they have to deal with it by reducing their budgets. What we've done is we have just tried to keep our spending equal, and the government is just simply better off than the people. I don't think the people have the kind of savings accounts that the state does. Now, that's a good thing because we've protected future taxpayers, by having these savings accounts. And I think that's important. But now let's look at what we can do to make the most of the people's property in these savings accounts. That's what the House Bill 270 and 271 effort is all about.
So just to follow up on that, according to the Oracle, i.e. the internet, from 2022 to 2023, Wyoming wages grew by 7.8%. In 2023 to 2024, the average annual wage saw a 4.2% increase. So just to provide some competing facts with that statement that Wyoming wages are stagnant, but the state government's wealth grows, just to provide clarity to some of those facts. So there is a pending motion on the table from Representative Harrelson, seconded by Wasserberger. Further discussion on that motion, which is to adopt House Bill 270. Senator Guru.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On and against the motion. To me, this is just a very simple question about a good idea versus a better idea. And I would gratefully and respectfully submit that we've been engaging in a better idea all along, and that is putting money in savings when we can, putting money in the permanent mineral trust fund when we can. Not only done so to historic levels. Also, doing everything, and this committee's been at the tip of the spear, working with the treasurer, working with the SLIB board to increase and maximize our investment income potential, to which this year we've done to a very large extent. And I believe we'll continue to do so. I'm voting no on this because I want to continue to have the flexibility to keep working with it. Having the ability to spend money doesn't mean we spend money. As a matter of fact, as I just said, we put more money to savings in the last 36, 72 months than any legislature before. And I know that this conservative group will continue to work towards those ends. I don't think we need this policy. I'll be voting no, and I urge you to do the same. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Further discussion? If not, I'll call for the question. Senator Beitman.
Are we going to take public comment before we go crazy and vote?
We might go crazy and vote. I think we're going to go crazy and vote. All those in favor say aye. Well, actually, it's a roll call vote because we're going to move to adopt House Bill 270. So roll call vote.
To adopt House Bill 270, Senator Beitman. Senator Crum. Senator Driscoll.
No.
Senator Guru.
No.
Senator Salazar.
Aye.
Representative Harrelson.
Aye.
Representative Nicholas.
No.
Representative Pendergraph.
Aye.
Representative Storer. Representative Wasserberger.
Aye.
Vice Chairman Bear.
Aye.
Chairman Nethercott. Madam Chairman, you have 6 ayes, 6 no.
That motion has failed. Representative Nicholas.
Thank you. I think when we express the votes, could you express it by House and Senate? Because we need a majority on both sides, just so we know what the split is. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, the Senate has 2 aye, 3 no. The House has 4 aye, 2 no.
All right, moving on to the proposed item on the agenda, which is House Bill 271. We will not, because these issues have been discussed, we'll entertain a motion, but at this time we'll take public comment on House Bill 271. Seeing no public, no, you don't take public comment after a motion. Seeing no public comment on this discussion of changing these percentages on House Bill 271 or previously, I'll entertain a motion at this time.
Madam Chairwoman, I would move to bring House Bill 271, the draft of House Bill 271 for consideration.
Moved by Representative Harrelson, seconded by Representative Pendergraph. Further discussion on the adoption of House Bill 271. Question having been called, roll call.
Madam Chairman, on House Bill 271, Senator Whitman, Senator Crum, Senator Driscoll, Senator Guru, Senator Salazar,
Aye.
Representative Haroldson,
Aye.
Representative Nicholas, Representative Pendergraph,
Aye.
Representative Storer, Representative Wasserberger,
Aye.
Vice Chairman Bear,
Aye.
Chairman Nethercott.
No.
Madam Chairman, you have 3 aye, 3 no for the Senate, 4 aye, 2 no for the House. Total is 7 aye, 5 no.
Say that one more time for the Senate.
3, I'm sorry, I want to verify yours. Was that an aye or a no?
My vote is a no vote.
I'm sorry, then my count is incorrect. My apologies. For the Senate, you have 2 aye, 4 no. For the House, you have 4 aye, 2 no, which is a 6-6 overall.
We're going to take a minute and recalculate those numbers. One more time, Karen.
Madam Chairman, what I have, and the members can correct me if I'm wrong. On the Senate side, Senator Beitman, Senator Salazar voted aye. Senators Crum, Driscoll, Guru, and Nethercott voted no. On the House side, I have Representatives Haroldson, Pendergraph, Wasserberger, and Bear voting aye. Representatives Nicholas and Storer voting no. Are there any changes?
Seeing Representative Nicholas?
I just want to reconfirm. It's my understanding that you need a majority from both sides for this committee to sponsor a bill.
Yeah, the motion has failed.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and move on to our 9 o'clock agenda item at 10 o'clock. So we are over budget and over time. So our 9 a.m. agenda item is the review of Senate File 169, response and options to the Strategic Investment and Projects account. Welcome, Mr. Fuller.
Yep, Madam Chairman, 20 members of the committee, 26 LSO 123, draft 0.5. My apologies, one moment. This is 3-01 in the online meeting materials. This is a bill draft the committee requested in June in response to 2025 Senate File 169 and the line item vetoes concerning the repeal of the Strategic Investments and Projects account. So this bill draft would repeal SIPA and it amends the disposition of investment earnings and guarantee amounts in response to those line item vetoes from the 2025 legislation. On page 2, lines 6 and 7, this is a conforming amendment to strike references to SIPA. And then page 2, line 15, another conforming amendment to strike a reference to treating the State Penitentiary Capital Construction account as a separate account from SIPA. Since SIPA is being repealed in this bill draft, that sentence is no longer necessary. Page 2, lines 21 and 22 just changes the fiscal year to 2027. And then page 3, line 3, current law requires a $10 million transfer from SIPA to the State Penitentiary Capital Construction account at the end of every fiscal year. This would change that $10 million transfer to come from the general fund beginning on June 30, 2027, and that was the change on page 2. Then moving on to page 3, line 3, or excuse me, page 4, lines 11 and 12 and 16, these are technical and conforming changes concerning the PMTF reserve account. Then moving on to page 5, lines 9 through 11. This is in 94719 Q1. The governor's line item veto in Senate File 169 provided that anything in excess of 2.5% of the 5-year market average of the PMTF would go entirely to SIPA. So that was a result of the line item veto. Before that line item veto and the adoption of Senate File 169, that was divided in equal amounts between SIPA and the Legislative Stabilization Reserve account. The change on page 5 in this bill draft would return to the enrolled version of Senate File 169 and have that entire excess amount go to the LSRA. Page 5, line 13 and 14 repeals 94220, which is the statute section that provides for SIPA, and then 94719B1, which requires a transfer from the PMTF reserve account to SIPA to guarantee the portion of the annual spending policy amount that's required to be transferred to SIPA. With the repeal of that account, that transfer would not be necessary. The staff comment on the bottom of page 5 through about midway through page 7 just provides the full text of the provisions that are repealed in this bill draft. Then page 7, line 34 and line 37 provide that SIPA is repealed. And then on July 1st, 2026, all funds in SIPA would be transferred to the general fund. Any unexpended funds appropriated from SIPA before July 1st, 2026 would be paid from the general fund. Any funds required to be transferred to SIPA as of that date would revert to the general fund. And then all accrued revenues that would otherwise be deposited in SIPA would go to the general fund. Page 8, line 10 provides a reporting requirement. So once on October 31st, 2026, and again by October 31st, 2027, the auditor would be required to report to the Joint Appropriations Committee on the amounts that are transferred to the general fund as a result of the repeal of SIPA. Then page 8, there was discussion at the Select Committee's last meeting concerning the LSR guarantee for the Public School Foundation Program account. I have included that language for the committee's reference. Ms. Scott prepared a memo on this topic concerning the use of the LSRA and SIPA in supporting K-12 funding. That's available with your meeting materials, but the bill draft just has that statutory language in 94219B, which is that LSRA guaranteeing the SFP up to that $100 million amount. That provision is not amended in this bill draft. It's a kind of a separate issue. The bill would be effective July 1st, 2026. And then, Madam Chairman, on page 9, that staff comment beginning on line 19, if there is any interest in the Select Committee, some of the changes with the governor's veto concerning a transfer to the Department of Corrections from the State Penitentiary Capital Construction account. The result of those line item vetoes open that account to the Department of Corrections. I have drafted language beginning on page 9, line 30, that would revert that back to the enrolled version of Senate File 169, which was a $9 million transfer to the Department of Corrections for integrating their security system. So that Section 6 language would effectuate that intent if the Select Committee is interested. With that, Madam Chairman, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Questions for Mr. Fuller? As a reminder to the committee, this is a bill draft that we have to move forward as a result of the quagmire we're in from the vetoes on the previous legislation. So regardless of how we might work it, we do need to resolve this issue. So Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Brian, is this bill draft constructed in such a way to kind of prevent the shenanigans we saw from the line item veto last time?
Yep.
Mr. Fuller.
Madam Chairman, President Beitman, because the bill does not have multiple appropriations, it would not be subject to line item veto. It, of course, Madam Chairman, would be subject to a straight veto of the entire bill.
Okay, further discussion, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Is that statement true if we adopt your suggested language on page 9?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, Vice Chairman Bear, I think the way that would be drafted, that would be one appropriation in the bill. That would call for one transfer to be reduced dollar for dollar for what the Department of Corrections have already spent.
Representative Nicholas, and one option for the committee to consider if you want to start working the bill versus asking Mr. Fuller questions is to make the motion second, work the bill, or just questions for Mr. Fuller at this time.
Well, I have a question on the bill for working the bill. And so I'm trying to understand. So this bill does two different things. Number one, it reduces the amount of dollars available to the chief executive as he's putting his budget together for the next biennium. And as I review this, roughly it's about a $270 million reduction in funds available because there'll be an automatic tip of those dollars into a reserve account. Is that accurate?
Madam Chairman, Representative Nicholas, the effect of the bill, that is correct, would reduce funding available as part of the budgetary process. In terms of the amount, Madam Chairman, I wouldn't have that information. I look to my colleagues in Budget Fiscal, Ms. Scott and Ms. Camerati, to confirm those dollar figures.
Representative Nicholas, before we get those numbers?
Yeah, well, and what I have is on the SIPA, on the revenue side, it's 269 million. On the SFP, it's 221 million. Those are the numbers I got yesterday. So let's just to walk through those numbers. My question is, if those, let's just start on the general fund side. If we pass this bill, that means that when we receive the chief executive's budget come in November, he's going to have $270 million less to put in his budget because you can't appropriate out of the reserve accounts. So the question I have is, if that's accurate, then perhaps one of the things we want to consider is where those dollars go, so that they don't necessarily go into the reserve accounts, because we passed the bills in the last couple of years that said that those reserve accounts are inviolate. And so if it goes to the general fund, or if it goes to some other location, then at least otherwise, the Appropriations Committee and the governor are going to have to find $270 million to put our budget to have a status quo budget. That's my understanding, and I just wanted to see if I'm accurate on this.
Madam Chairman, I would like to, if it's okay, pass out the information we had at our last meeting that compared all the dollar differences of these two different versions of this bill, and then we could discuss it. Would that be okay?
And Madam Chairman, just particularly for Senator Salazar, this is on the website, the Select Committee, for the June meeting, this fiscal comparison chart that Ms. Scott is handing out.
Is it this one? Is it set to here?
Yeah.
This is numbers.
Yeah. So
this is the number. That's how many frozen days are there.
this is going back. This bill is going back to this. Right? This is the way it came out of the legislature. So this bill.
No, I think you have to go down to
So
these numbers,
right.
because this is going to come, that's the first 2 something that comes from right there.
Oh, he's just looking at 1 year, not the total.
Right, so it's actually more.
Right.
So why don't you explain that?
Okay. So that's the difference from the way it was to the stuff of the Senate. And then if we want to talk about the difference from the governor's veto to the way that it was. The
Governor just put this back in.
Yeah.
So that's the number.
Okay. So the governor is going to have 191.6 million less in the reserve. He's going to have more in the SFP. And okay. Madam Chairman, if I could have everybody look at scenario 6, which is in the blue. That's the difference of the enacted law minus the enrolled act, which the bill that Brian has presented is basically the same as what the enrolled act was. And so the total difference, if you want to look at the total line there, is that there's going to be 191.6 million less in the LSRA, and there would be 437.9 million more that remains in the SIPA and 358.6 million more to the SFP. So that's the comparison of the law as it is today compared to the law that as it passed out of the legislature. And by going back to the law as it passed out of the legislature, Representative Nicholas's comment was that the governor is going to have less available in those accounts that he can recommend budgets from, make recommendations for spending in. And that is correct, because he can't make recommendations from the LSRA beyond 5% of the LSRA balance. So I hope that answers the question.
Further discussion? Representative Nicholas?
I want to say it another way. If you go to the bottom box, and if you look at under SIPA, that's what goes away. So look at FY 2027, that's 147 million. And FY 2028, 122 million. Those two numbers go away by passing this current bill as drafted. That's the 269 million that I was talking about earlier that is no longer available for the general fund side in the budget. So that means if you took our existing budget and you had to, as appropriators and as the legislature begins crafting the budget for next year, we're going to have to find, either we have to cut 270 million or we got to find it someplace else. Because those dollars will no longer be available to the governor and they will be tipping into the reserve accounts. And those are by statute inviolate once it's there. So the question is, do we want to tie up those dollars permanently without statutory changes to our reserve accounts by adopting 169? And that, I just want to lay that out because I think that's correct, but I just want to make sure that my statement is accurate. So.
Madam Chairman, I believe that is an accurate statement.
Say that one more time, Ms. Scott, a little louder.
Madam Chairman, if you want to look at the fiscal year 27 and 28 numbers, as Representative Nicholas did, that is accurate.
On that, it's the same thing having to do on this in the SFP. That's a lost revenue of $221 million for the biennium. Because you take FY 2027, that's 120 million, and a 2028 is 100 million. So if that happens, then that goes off of, and that will, my question is, I believe that will adjust then the long-term forecast, which has a $184 million deficit, and increase it by 221 million.
So Representative Nicholas, what, based on your concerns, and these concerns I think are shared by the committee, as well as the primary purpose of the bill with these collateral consequences, which is to make the budget more transparent and to unwind some of these knotted accounts and make it a little bit simpler. And so that was how and why the bill passed to begin with, was to eliminate the SIPA account to create a more transparent budget. Recognizing the concerns of the consequence of eliminating that account and how it is knotted and dangerously attached now to things it shouldn't be, do you have a proposed solution or an amendment to protect the consequences of the elimination of this account for the purposes of transparency?
So what I'm just trying to explain are, number one, the unforeseen consequences of passing 169, because this issue really wasn't addressed on the floor. Actually, it was a little bit on the House side, but it wasn't on the Senate side. The only solution, I think, that grants us the greatest leeway is to modify where the funds go. So, and not put them directly into the reserve accounts because it becomes inviolate. And not untouchable by either us or the governor once they transfer. So that's, there are different ways to do that, but that's the easy answer to that question is if we capture these funds, if we get rid of the SIPA, then we have to change the flow to make those dollars available someplace else and not the tips and prevent that tips going into the reserve accounts. And once again, Polly, let me know if I'm speaking incorrectly, but I think that's accurate.
Madam Chairman, I didn't hear the entire comment, but I just wanted to clarify that would only be amounts in excess of the spending policy amount that would go to the reserve account.
All right, any further discussion? Before we hear from public comment.
Well, let me just follow up on her comment, and because she's absolutely correct. And that's because we have a 7+% return on our investments.
Mhm.
And it's that excess that's going to be tipping, which are these amount of dollars, basically. If you go back and look at what the latest forecast, we're around 500 and some odd million on the general fund side and 300 and some odd million on the school side. So.
All right, any further public comment? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Committee, back to you. Is there a motion on the bill?
I move to advance the bill as drafted with no amendments.
Well, the motion is to adopt the bill. For clarity procedurally, if there's a second, the bill can be amended, the proposed bill. So, but the proposal is to adopt the bill as currently drafted. So that's moved by Representative Baer, seconded by Representative Haroldson. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, roll call. There are comments in the bill draft that do need to be addressed, but question having been called, roll call.
For 26 LSO 0123, Senator Biteman. Senator Crum. Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Senator Guru. Senator Salazar.
Aye.
Representative Haroldson.
Aye.
Representative Nicholas.
No.
Representative Pendergraph.
Aye.
Representative Storer. Representative Wasserberger. Vice Chairman Baer.
Aye.
Chairman Nethercott. Madam Chairman, Senate has 6 ayes, House has 4 ayes, 2 no.
Has passed. We will start that off in the House. All right, moving on to our 10 a.m. agenda item. We are picking up some speed. We are dealing with compounding investment permanent revenue account, looking at 26 LSO 119. We will start with our LSO legal staff. Welcome, Mr. Shaw.
Madam Chair, thank you. I will just give a quick overview of that first bill draft. It's the constitutional amendment at 26 LSO 119. The committee will recall that this is a subject that came up last year, and it's the advantage of investing a permanent account for 30 or more years in order to take advantage of the compounding effect of money. The Treasurer's Office at our last meeting presented a proposed bill draft with some language, and LSO was directed to use that language in addition to other constitutional provisions that create permanent funds to draft a constitutional amendment that would create this fund, and that's what this does. The fund is called the Compounding Investments Permanent Revenue Account. It invests these funds for a minimum of 30 years and then directs their expenditure, and in the meantime, the funds can be reinvested but are otherwise inviolate. It's created at Article 15, Section 21, the same place that things like the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund are created. So turning to page 2 of the bill draft in subsection A, starting on line 9, It creates the account, the Wyoming Compounding Investment Permanent Revenue Account. It's funded with one or more annual appropriations from the legislature in amounts determined by the legislature. That was this committee's directive at the last meeting. And in other words, it does not require the legislature to make specific appropriations to that account in excess of $1. I mean, the legislature could potentially put $1 in a year. The request was also to make those investments in the fund in consultation with the Investment Funds Committee. Because the Investment Funds Committee is a statutory beast and not a matter of constitutional law, LSO inserted there in consultation with the state treasurer, which of course would allow the state treasurer to consult with whatever its Investment Funds Committee is at the time. The amounts are appropriated or must be kept in the account for 30 years or more, and they're inviolate except for as otherwise provided, because this constitutional amendment does allow those amounts to be invested and deposited back to the account, be reinvested, deposited back in the account for 30 years. So it's inviolate other than at the end of that 30 years, they can start to be expended. Moving on to page 3, then it talks about distribution of the earnings. The earnings after 30 years can be deposited, upon which time the earnings attributable to the account deposits made in the year 30 years prior may be distributed as prescribed by the legislature to fund a specific list of items. And those are on lines 4 and 5 on page 3, those being infrastructure, education, fixed government expenses, and to address inflation and the reduction of tax burdens. The subsection C on line 7 through 13 is virtually identical to the first subsection B. It just provides for the timing of distributions after that, after the 30th year into the 31st and subsequent years. The same conditions apply. You know, I won't speak for the treasurer. He has provided a handout that was going to address some of my issues. So I'll let him speak to those rather than me discussing those, but some of the impacts of some of the provisions. And Madam Chair, that's the bill.
Questions for Mr. Fuller? Representative Nicholas.
So I'm curious, thank you, Madam Chairman. A couple different questions. On page 1, on the lines 1 through 5, it says dedicated to infrastructure, education, government expenses, inflation, and reduction of tax burdens. So what's the purpose of that language, and why are we restricting it, and why are we making it so broad at the same time?
Madam Chairman, Representative Nicholas, those were expenditures that were directed. That was a suggestion by the Treasurer's Office to limit those expenditures for those purposes. As to their broadness, I agree that there's leeway in what can be addressed under those broad categories, but that I could ask, I guess, the Treasurer's Office to explain those.
Follow up, because I mean, that's a list with an "and" at the end of it. That suggests to me that you're going to almost have to, if you're going to do one, you have to do the other.
Madam Chair, Representative Nicholas, I think the alternative would be "or," and I think "or" limits them. So I don't think the "and" necessarily, we have this discussion all the time when we're interpreting statutes, but I think "or" would be the other alternative, and it would be more restrictive because it implies it's one or the other, not all of them. So I interpret that language to allow you to include any of those items, not every one of them.
And so that's language that came from the Treasurer's Office.
Madam Chairman, that's correct.
Then, Madam Chairman, on page, I'm curious about section 2, page 3. It says the legislature would be required to make annual deposits to the funds for 30 years. So you're saying we have to make, that language says it's mandatory.
Mr. Shaw.
Representative Nicholas, that is correct. In an amount determined by the legislature. So we could do $1 a year, but we have to make some appropriation annually.
And then I'm curious, Madam Chairman, follow up on the payout, because if you want to get the maximum benefit over time, it seems to me that if you want, and you want a 30-year growth period, right? On year 31, it's a new 30 years. So it moves like this. And so in terms of distributions for in and out, how does each annual contribution disbursement, how is that monitored or impacted on distribution after the 30 years? The first 30 years.
Madam Chairman and Representative Nicholas, the way this is drafted, it's interesting in that it would require in the 31st year for the investment earnings from the first year and only those investment earnings to be available for expenditure. In the second year, it would be the first and second, anything remaining from the first year, and the second year investments, earnings from those deposits would be subject to expenditure.
And so that's part of my question, because I'm not sure how you could, because you're compounding those dollars over time on top of each other. And somehow you're going to have to separate every year and the compound interest one way or the other, and or losses over time. And I'm not sure that that's doable.
Madam Chairman, Representative Nicholas, I'm not an accountant and I don't know, but I briefly discussed that with the treasurer at the treasurer's conference, and that was a feature of last year's bill, the statutory approach to this, but I don't know the answer to that, and I had the same concerns.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for Mr. Shaw? Senator Beitman?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, my question was on the vagueness of the terms on, what is that, page 3, line 4, where it talks about, it lists out infrastructure, education, fixed government expenses, and to address inflation and the reduction of tax burdens. I noticed, in our Constitution, anytime we do something like that, it seems to be ripe for Supreme Court challenges and district courts to interpret that whichever way they please. Are these terms overly broad in your opinion and could lead us into some future court entanglements?
Mr. Shaw?
Madam Chairman, Senator Beitman, I don't have an opinion on whether they're overly broad because that is truly a policy question. I mean, by placing any limits in the Constitution, you naturally then it is a limit, and so it could be subject to challenge in the future when we try to do something outside of that. But whether or not they are broad, and whether that's the legislature's intent to do that or not, I don't know. I mean, we could do something much more specific. We could do something even more broad. I think that's a policy question.
Follow up. For instance, the term education, the way it's listed, could that mean any kind of education, homeschool to public? Is it limited to K-12? Could it be used for higher education? Those are the types of questions. In 30 years, the people are going to be very mad at us if we don't get this right because we made it vague, and get them in trouble if they want to put money into an ESA account. And then the court says, nope, you can't. And they meant public education. It doesn't say public education, but that's what they meant. And they'll just interpret it the way they want. So do we need to be very specific, or is it your recommendation we would just put a period after prescribed by the legislature and just leave it at that?
Sure. Madam Chairman, President Beitman, that's a great question. I think that the term education as drafted is very broad. Whenever, though, constitutional provisions are not interpreted on their own, I mean, you can't, the inclusion of education here doesn't negate any other constitutional provisions which would limit expenditures on education. So if that provision is declared unconstitutional, this would not undo that unconstitutionality. However, certainly it's broad. I mean, whether it's K-12 or higher education or public schools or not, I think is left open in this interpretation of the statute, and it likely includes all of those things in the broader term education.
Mr. Shaw, thank you. With that, we'll turn to any further public comment. Treasurer Meyer. Just as a notice to members of the public, we will not get to our 11 a.m. meeting time. We will likely take a break at 11 a.m. So just a note to the treasurer and everyone in the room that we will be taking a lunch break at 11 a.m.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Let's just go through the first 5 lines there, so you kind of get an idea about what was going on. I would say the first thing is we need an Oxford comma after expenses before the and in line 4. If we do that, then essentially that means that everything before and after the and are included. So that's how that rolls. The fixed government expenses, what I was trying to do there was come up with language, and there may be better language to look at, that we're not going to use this to fund the growth of government. We wanted to look at what government was, and if there was a need, that we had a shortfall in what government was at that time, then that's what we would fund it for. And there may be a better way to express that idea. I just wanted to make sure that people understood that this wasn't a fundraising idea that was going to grow government. So, to the extent that you come up with better language than that, perhaps something that does not expand the growth of government, a negative in there. I tried to make it a positive, but that's what we were trying to get to on that. Infrastructure was the first one because essentially a lot of our infrastructure is aging out. Concrete, you look at the La Perelle Dam, that thing was over 100 years old. We've got literally billions of dollars worth of concrete out there in different irrigation infrastructure projects that are going to have to be repaired. You had the huge amount of money that they're spending on the tunnels over in Goshen County. So those things are not going to stop. They're going to continue to be there. And so that I thought was one of the biggest ones. Education was purposely broad because if you say as prescribed by the legislature, that the whole Constitution at that point in time, it's used in context and not necessarily specific. So this broadens that out to the extent that the prohibitions that you have about only using money for public education would necessarily, this would allow it to be broader than that. If you say as prescribed, then that part of the Constitution would actually be visited upon as prescribed when it's concerned educational spending, because that's where you have the specific. So it was purposely left broad, and purposely left broad because education could be in areas where one of the things that we have is figuring out some way to actually do more skills training, looking at that's where a lot of people are going to be able to get their livelihood even in 30 years. Companies and are going to have to basically re-educate every 7 to 10 years. So it is a broad thing there. And at that point in time, it's really as the legislature may appropriate those funds to. So, if you wanted to put something in here that was restrictive and actually got the legislators in there, it would be to say not as prescribed, but as appropriated by the legislature in that time period. So that might be an appropriate modification. So you have the flexibility and you also have the oversight, and the oversight is through the appropriation process. Inflationary expenses, because we know we have inflationary expenses. That's always going to be there as long as we have a federal government that overspends and or a Fed that lowers the interest rate too low. So those are things that are going to happen. We know they're going to occur. I didn't try to do everything, for everybody, but these are things that I think people are really interested in. They know they're going to occur, and the reduction of tax burdens, because that's one of the things that we've always said is a big part about our investments, that they keep taxes low. You'd have another 4 or 5% sales tax if we didn't have the investment revenue that actually was generated by the forethought of our forefathers as far as the permanent mineral trust funds and separate taxes. So this essentially moves us to that other area. And it is the most efficient method of investing, and that's essentially in compounded interest or compounding your investments. Looking to the words on the next page here, let's go to the compounded interest that's created there. All earnings from the investment of Wyoming compounded annual revenue shall be held in an account and reinvested for not less than 30 years, upon which the earnings attributable. And attributable is a broader, I guess, concept than the investment earnings accounted for, because you can attribute over that time period, and you are compounding. So you really don't know what you have in that area until the end of that 30-year period. Yeah, but you can make an attribution as far as what funds that were invested over that time period and when they got there. Now, I didn't get into a lot of detail in here about the amount of funds and the difference where they should be. We can look at that statutorily, because I think that a lot of times in the Constitution, less is more, but you want to make sure that you got enough bones on it so you're going in the right direction. Then I added for reinvestment because I wanted to make it clear that even though it was in another part here, that the annual distributions, that what was left over, but I think they limited it to the first $100 million, the way I had read that. So I fleshed that out a little bit and put percentages in there. And I used a range. And the reason I used a range, because as the funds get bigger, you don't have to distribute 62.5%, but you should always distribute at least half of it so you stay ahead of inflation. So you don't want to just, spend 90% of it, because then in 30 years, you're starting from, less than a zero-sum gain if you only still have 100 million to invest when you're going to keep up with inflation and keep this growing on track, to actually address those issues. So we put a range in there for, not less than 50, no more than 62.5. And I think 62.5 might be in the first one, but you get a couple of cycles out. There's no need to, distribute that much. And then I add reinvestments again down on line 22. And then I wanted to make sure that this is not just for long-term revenue, but it was actually long-term distributive revenue. So people know that it is going to be distributed. It's just not going to sit there and grow forever. So those are some of the highlights of the thought process on this. But if you're going to, actually, and it was all deposits, because it said all original deposits, and that would have meant it was just the first $100 million that moved forward in that. And so I wanted to make sure that all the deposits would remain in the fund in perpetuity to be reinvested and provide the distributed revenue. But that split is defined in the other area there. A lot of this is going to have to be in statute. And as far as how and when, and I guess we'll go to that when we get to the statutory one. We'll go ahead and discuss some of the fine print about how you should be doing it if you're going to do it, and have that discussion at that time. But yeah, from my perspective, all of the things that are in the first part of that's giving you the broad overview about where the earnings are going to be dedicated. These were things that I knew that people are important. You may have other areas that you think that should be included in the list, or you may have language that would make it a little more flexible to have the legislators do that way. I think if you add as appropriated at that time period, I think that really allows the people that are going to be there in the future to actually be able to make the decisions.
Any additional questions for Treasurer Meyer? Representative Wasserberger.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Treasurer Meyer, thank you for taking the time to break this down for us today. Just got a question for you, maybe some clarification. Just wondering if we were to choose to pass this and we made that decision to start doing the appropriations each year. in the very beginning of the first year, would there be an agreed amount lump sum that we do, and then on top of that, add that contribution determined by the legislature that first year? The second question that I would have is, and maybe the language here already describes that, but for clarification, over the duration of that 30 years, would we agree to just a same amount that's going to be done each and every year? Would the legislature make that decision each year if it's going to be a little bit more or a little bit less?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that really is in the statutory part that we're going to look at. If we discuss it now, I guess. One of the use cases is actually to replace the enough money that would actually replace the loss of mineral revenue, and that's somewhere around $600 or $700 million in that range. And then the nuts and bolts of it is that these are going to be invested in privates, and then you have to look at how to put together a diversified portfolio of privates. And so every year you should be investing somewhere between 3 and 5 different private enterprises, private equity and private credit. And then it has to be at a level that is necessarily consistent, because you have different vintages. So one year you may have a poor year, the next year you may have a bad year, the next year you may have a good year and a good year and a good year. But if you don't have some consistency about what goes in and enough money to make investments at a level that is meaningful in basically the standard amounts that people do invest in those type of investments, then you get a lot of volatility and variation of what comes in. It's the old story of garbage in and garbage out. If you only invest 10 million one year and you do 100 million the next year, you're only investing in that 1 year 10 or 15 million in probably one private equity and one private credit circumstance. If you have 100 million, then you're investing in 4 to 5, and so you have that diversity. So when you're setting it up, you have to make sure that you have enough money that's a base level, and enough money to give you diversity in the different asset classes of privates. So when you come out the other end, you don't have a lot of variation as far as what you're going to have for the 30 years down the road to actually address the different issues. So it's just like if we had a budget today that varied 40% every year, it would really be hard to budget about, how we're going to pay for something. And it's not any different today than it would be 30 years from now. And that goes into another part that's in there, is that on day one, you just don't say you're going to do 30, 40, or 50% of the earnings, because privates you have to roll off. It takes you about 4 years to I guess, prudently roll off your privates, or you get into a situation where you sell them on the secondary market at distressed costs or distressed prices. That happened to the Ivy League schools when they had 70 or 80% of their investments in privates. They had to make payrolls, they had to do things for the college, and they sold some things at anywhere from 20 to 40% plus discounts. So you structure the whole thing about how it's going to come out, and then you work back to how much money you should put in. And so you got a minimum there. I would say the minimum would be 50 million. I think the max that you would probably put in on an annual basis, 100 million. Where you get the money, I think that there's going to be some flexibility if we pass the different constitutional amendments on earnings. That'll provide some flexibility. It'll free up some areas where we haven't been able to necessarily utilize different areas. Those will also free up some of the increases or the alpha that we have, because we have roughly, on average, $200 to $250 million a year in alpha, and that's a lot more than what we actually need to fund a generational fund or a CIPRA fund or whatever we want to call or brand it. So, there are areas there as we move forward. that I think we can do it with her earnings, do it with our outperformance, and do it with some flexibility that we're going to try to gain in a couple of these constitutional amendments.
All right, we are running dangerously short on time in
Okay.
the short term. We're going to take a break in 2 minutes. And so we have really tight schedule today. So want to be mindful for everyone to keep your comments pretty pithy. Want to encourage robust debate. Follow up, Representative Wasserberger. Just know there'll be a hard stop in about 2 minutes and then we'll come back at 12:30. So we're doing an amendment to the agenda. We'll take lunch from 11 to 12:30. We'll come back at 12:30. We obviously won't have time to get through this right now. Pithy. Representative Wasserberger.
Thank you. I'll try to be really quick. So just another question. This maybe, thank you for explaining that first one. And then this maybe would be something that you would say that we have to define in the statute. So for each year that we're doing an appropriation, what would your suggestion be? Would there just be a lump sum that goes in at the very beginning of the year each time when we do an appropriation, or is there a fixed amount that we do each month or each week or each
Well,
day?
I think you want to try to keep it down to, no more than, not on a monthly basis. Quarterly would probably be the greatest frequency. Of course, it's always nice to have it at the first of the year, although you probably won't implement a lot of these things until, it takes about 3 to 4 months to onboard a private. So, biannually would probably be, every 6 months would probably be something you could do easy enough. And that would allow you to actually generate some different income from different areas to actually fund it as it moves forward. Yes, but yeah, probably somewhere between that 50 million twice a year, or 100 million upfront. And I did put in the statutory thing there to allow for a loan. One of the things that talking to some the folks on the SLIB board, that if you took a loan from the LISRA, and what you would do is basically in 30 years you would pay 700 million back off of a 100 million loan, so 600 in earnings and 100 there. That would carry forward somewhere between 900 and $1 billion forward for the next cycle. The 600 to 700 million would essentially take all of the revenues that we've lost, from the coal industry and other industries, and actually hold that harmless as far as the amount of money back to the budget. And then that gets you started to there, and the other just moves it forward. You have a critical mass going forward to stay ahead of inflation and stay ahead of the deteriorating infrastructure and another concern.
All right. Thank you, Treasurer Meyer. Thank you, Representative. We're going to go ahead and take our lunch break right now. We will come back. We're taking our lunch break right now. We will be back at 12:30. The meeting is now in recess. We'll be back at 12:30.